Hey internets, now is the time for my second quarterly questions and answers red pill and gold pill session. I get a lot of questions in response to my videos, and some of those questions are actually pretty good. And some of you might be wondering, how do I get my own question answered on one of these videos? Well, the way I do it is, first off, people who are either members or subscribe stars get first dibs. I mean, it's kind of only fair considering they give me money to help me pay the bills. But I also answer questions from people who are public subscribers, which, by the way, is free. Anybody can be a public subscriber. It does not cost you any money. If you don't know how to do it, just Google it. But anyways, here we go, starting with channel members. First question, realistically, how do we convince the authorities to punish crimes proportionately? Welp, it looks like we're starting things out with a little bit of a black pill here, because unfortunately you kind of can't. Because the thing is, the state is a system that is unaccountable to actual economic forces, and so thus they don't really have to do what we want them to do. Now, you can put some pressure on them, like for instance showing the negative outcome of judges who let go somebody who's a 70-time offender or something like that, who then later goes on to murder somebody because of course you allowed somebody like that onto the streets. And so you can kind of push against really stupid things like equity enforcement, but it will never really be a perfect system of doing that because democracy itself is flawed. Because as long as we have democracy, you're never gonna see crimes being perfectly punished proportionately. Because, well, voters are kinda dumb. They're not rational. You can try and work it to make things a little better within the framework of democracy, so trying to do things to convince people what works and what doesn't, but beyond that, there really isn't anything you can do. Aside from just calling the authorities out when they do something stupid, but even then, that's not really a guarantee. But realistically, that's pretty much all you can do. Next question. Why is it that very privileged people, i.e. those born into wealth who do not have to work, often lead towards socialism? One of my friends has never had a job, spends all day playing League and Destiny 2, lives in his parents with a 3-story house, and yet he is adamant about how evil capitalism is. So I kind of have some pretty good first-hand experience as to why they think this way, because I went to a high school that had a lot of rich kids. Basically, they're just spoiled and they live in a bubble. And so they have a very low incentive to learn how the real world works outside of that bubble. That's it. It's actually kind of a simple answer. They're ultimately raised in a bubble, and so they don't really understand how reality works. But they do know that not having to work is nice and feels good, and so they lead towards these kind of moralistic utopian ideals. And another reason they do it is just guilt, and thinking that by being progressive, they are absolving themselves of that guilt. They see themselves as, oh, I was raised with all this good stuff, and that makes me privileged, and so I need to push for everybody else to have all this good stuff for free, or else I'm guilty of sustaining an unfair system or something like that. And the final reason is just kind of academic virtue signaling midwittery. Ever since the civil rights era, it kind of became intellectually trendy to be left-leaning, and so the fallacy of thinking that the government can intervene to create equality, and this assumption that equality is the ultimate pinnacle of morality, it just kind of became popular in intelligentsia, and so a lot of them just simply believe it because they're raised in that environment, and the vast majority of people simply believe what they're raised in as a way of getting along with society. That's just kind of another unfortunate black pill of human psychology. Most people don't actually believe things for logical reasons. Most people believe things as a way of fitting in with the herd. That's why when you see certain beliefs reaching a level of 50% or greater adaptation, a lot of times you'll just see a sudden shift, and a whole bunch of extra people will then adapt the same belief. It's because there is in fact a good portion of humanity who their epistemology is unironically just the bandwagon fallacy. Basically, they believe it because it's a way for them to signal their status in the social order that they live in. Next question. What's your opinion on Nick Land and accelerationism in general? Honestly, I'm not that familiar with Nick Land. I've heard a few things about him, but accelerationism, that question is different, and it kind of depends on what you mean by accelerationism. Because one form of accelerationism is just, oh, we should get rid of regulation and let capitalism accelerate to its desired conclusion. And then there's another meaning of accelerationism, which is just that we should let society accelerate towards its destruction, or basically vote for communism so that way we can destroy our bad society, and that will hopefully get us closer towards a better society. And the former version of accelerationism kind of does make sense, whereas the latter version absolutely doesn't make sense. Because in the latter version, accelerationism is kind of a way of thinking that just about any political ideology can take on, and the problem with it is there's no real guarantee that when you accelerate society towards its destruction, that your ideology is going to be the one that arises from the ashes. Usually what happens is it just creates a power vacuum for whoever happens to have the most power at the time, and you just end up with a crappy dictatorship in control of society instead. That's what's historically always happened, and there's no real thing you can do in order to prevent that from happening. And so it's just historically a bad strategy to take. However, the former definition in terms of just accelerating capitalism to its logical conclusions, well, that's just accelerating the market towards getting it towards its most efficient state. That type of accelerationism is fine. Next question. What is your opinion on Dave Smith? I think Liquid Zool did a great job conveying my personal issues with the man, but I would love to hear your take on him. Oof, yeah, there's another one that I need to make a whole entire video on. I really wish I had more energy to do so. I mean, the basic question there is whether the nap comes first or consequences come first. That I would see as the issue of Dave Smith, is that he places the value of consequentialism above the NAP, but still considers it to be important. Whereas the Zuluism is basically just nap and that's it. Sometimes they're called the naptists. And I think both those positions are wrong in different ways. I kind of want to answer this in an entire video I'm working on libertarian strategy, and the gist of it is that we're kind of stuck in a really bad false dichotomy, because neither of the strategies really work. The Dave Smith strategy kind of doesn't work because you're abandoning libertarianism, and thus you can't have libertarian victory because you're not a libertarian anymore when you're that pragmatic. Whereas the naptist strategy, where they're just kind of interpreting everything through the lens of the nap, regardless of context, ends up proposing insane ideas that nobody will ever want to go along with, such as, oh, we should have crack addicts on public schools, and thus they also abandon victory because they propose ideas that no one's going to realistically go along with. And so there's really a need for a practical libertarian strategy where we focus on fixing things in a specific order that actually has a chance of creating a libertarian society and is also things that people will actually want to do. Next question. Can you do a Nick Fuentes video or perhaps something on the alt-right? Thanks, King. Well, funny you say that. You're probably going to be pretty happy this month. That is one of the videos that I have nearest to completion, actually. Next question. Will you ever make a video on the situation in Europe? While I enjoy learning about the American situation, I'm sure other European viewers like myself would be thrilled for it. I've definitely thought about doing things on Europe. I've made a few videos on it in the past. It's not that I don't understand why Europe is important. It's just that as an American, it's best I focus on politics from an American angle. Plus, the United States policy tends to have an effect on global policy in a way that other countries don't. I'm not trying to be arrogant there and saying, oh, America's the greatest nation ever. I don't believe that at all. It's just a fact that American politics kind of bleeds into other nations. However, I do pay attention to Europe, and sometimes I do comment a little bit more about what's happening around that area on Twitter sometimes, or X as it's now called again. It's going to be a really long time before we stop calling Twitter X. But yeah, I say that because recently I made a post in regards to that guy who received a sentence simply for saying offensive things online. It's really nutty. Especially the UK has gotten pretty much 1984. Definitely not a good situation, and I think it's very telling to see people cheering that on. Anyway, next question. General thoughts on Peter Thiel. Everyone seems to think he's the next Antichrist, although I really can't find anything specifically evil he's done other than making tracking cameras. Do you think it's hypocritical of him to say he's a libertarian while working to increase surveillance state ability? Population control tech, like basic tracking city cameras, inherently anti-libertarian, seeing how it can be used by authoritarians. Well, I mean, any technology can be used by authoritarians. Just about anything can be good or evil depending on how it's used. And yes, you can definitely see it how it's kind of bad to have a bunch of surveillance technology, because of course the government abuses it, but you also have to ask yourself a really simple question. Would people buy this stuff voluntarily? Yes or no? And the answer is, of course you would. A lot of surveillance technology for the private sector is amazingly useful. Like rigging your house with a ring system, for example, is a pretty good deterrent against crime, and if crime is committed against you, you may be able to use the surveillance footage to, actually track down the criminal, and hopefully get some restitution out of that. But I can definitely understand why people see what he's doing as a little bit yikesy. Because yeah, doing it specifically to give it to the government, and of course getting subsidies and pushback for that, yeah, it is a little hypocritical. Next question. How would a libertarian state tackle climate change, assuming it's a serious problem that requires immediate continued action? That's a good question, although unfortunately the answer would be really, really long to explain it at length. The short answer would be recognizing that doing something that negatively affects somebody else's property does technically go against the NAP, and thus pollution, when it can be proven to actually negatively affect other people's property, is thus something that could, in theory, be solved by a private court, just as much as it can be solved by a public court within a statist system or a libertarian society or whatever. So it's something that would definitely need some kind of resolution. One simple way to do it, one that's kind of a little bit practical, would be making it so carbon credits are something that could be homesteaded. Exactly how that could be done would of course be very, very complicated, but that's the basic gist of it. Just like polluting a water is technically a violation against the NAP against everyone downstream for where you're polluting the atmosphere would also be a violation of the NAP. And so thus the courts would have to find some kind of solution to it. And yes, that could include fines and physical removal, you could say, against main offenders. Next question. In libertarian theory, is there a separation between ethics and morality? And to further clarify, it's going to be the Liquid Zulu and David Smith question again. I think what a lot of people get wrong is they tend to stick to one ethical epistemology and then just discount all the others. When in reality, a lot of different ethical systems are valid, it's just which ones are more valid than each other. For instance, the video I did on consequentialism, that point of the video wasn't to say that consequentialism is bad. Consequentialism can actually be very, very good, as long as you understand that consequentialism should exist beneath the NAP. Like, for example, if you have one thing that will help your family out a lot, and it doesn't violate the NAP, versus one thing that will not help your family out at all, and it also doesn't violate the NAP, which one are you going to choose? Well, obviously you're going to go with the one that has better consequences. Same thing with care-harm morality. I don't think care-harm morality is necessarily bad, it's just bad when you place it above consequentialism, and especially bad when you place it above the NAP. And that's a better way, I believe, to look at morality that will actually help you understand strategy as well as ethics. The problem I often see is people will stick to one of these, like for example, people who are rule utilitarians, and they stick strictly to that, and they just assert as if that's some kind of axiom that their morality is correct. And then they'll use that to justify stealing so long as it has a good outcome. When in reality, it makes more sense to say that both stealing is bad and the bad outcome is bad. The best way I guess you could visualize this is think of it as kind of a pyramid structure, a pyramid of ethics, with negative rights that you absolutely should not violate at the top, also known as the NAP, and then below that consequentialism, and then below that care harm, and then below that other forms of morality, and then basically the lower you go, the more subjective things get. That's how I view meta-ethics anyways. And I think a lot of people miss that with those of us libertarians who are either closed borders or not for opening the borders wider way. It's actually not so much a consequentialist argument, it's more of recognizing that both open borders and closed borders would violate the NAP in some way due to how the status system currently operates. And so thus consequentialism can be used as kind of a tiebreaker between two things that both violate the NAP, then you can at least go with the one that has less violations. That's pretty much the only time it makes sense to look at something beneath another one on the pyramid. If everything above it sucks, then you can start looking at other systems of ethics. That's the actual basis of that argument anyway. And unfortunately, Dave Smith hasn't really studied ethics that much, but he at least understands optics, which I think I've said in the past, optics are stupid, but kind of important. And so that debate was pretty bad between Zulu and Smith, to be honest, because what happened was Zulu was mostly correct on philosophy, whereas Smith was more correct on optics and rhetoric, but wrong on mostly everything else. And so there really wasn't a winner in that debate. I mean, sadly, I'd have to say that libertarianism was a loser in the debate. I think that came across to the average normie as very cringe. Sad to say. Anyway, next question. What becomes of the private property owned by those who were previously state agents in Ancapistan? Or long version, the god that failed Hoppe says that in the event of transition to Ancapistan, government agents who previously controlled public lands would have no legitimate claim to homestead those lands. I would agree with that. And my question, what about the private property that these agents may have acquired through voluntary market exchanges but using funds originally derived from taxes? Oh boy, yeah, that. To be fair, Hoppe himself said it would be messy and answered that it would be up to the private lawyers and judges to settle disputes. Would such acquisitions be considered invalid under the title transfer theory? If so, who would rightfully own those assets in a post-state society? Yeah, I would agree with Hoppe on that. It would be messy, and the reason it would be messy is because there's a lot of gray area there, and actually not a whole lot of black and white. It's almost impossible to exist in the society that we currently live in without taking advantage of a subsidy in some way, because even just the infrastructure around us is subsidized, and that's what a lot of property lines are drawn over. This is actually another reason why you don't want to be a strict NAPtist and only consider the NAP, because the reality is it's actually kind of impossible to not violate the NAP in the way society currently works. If you are living in a first world country and you have property, or even if you're just living in a property in any way, you are to a very small degree violating the NAP. There's no getting around it. And so the answer to your question, as annoying as it is that it would have to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. Like for instance, if a person privately bought a piece of land legitimately for about $100,000, but they were subsidized by $25,000 in some way, and then they transformed the land and build a house on top of it that was worth about $800,000. Well, whether or not they would fully own that land outright or owe that $25K back, that's kind of for the courts to decide. It depends depends kind of on whether or not they had any voluntary say of taking advantage of that subsidy, or if it was just something that was forced upon them or whatever. There's no straight answer there. Next question. How does anti-idpol libertarianism reckon with the fact that economics is politics of the head while identity is politics of the heart? Okay, this is a long one. What I mean by this is that race, nation, and faith have been the foundation of all socio-political upheavals on Earth from time immemorial to the present. Even the utopian dreams of Jacobins and Bolsheviks largely rose to power out of minority discontent with a majority ethnic group's power. People may be discontent with burdensome taxes, of course, but it will never have the emotional weight which arises from the instinct of self-preservation that arouses fear of migrant invasions of the West. The desire to forge their own destiny compelled the masses of Africa and Asia to resist the dominion of Europe, even when the natives economically benefited from the empire, especially the Africans. Okay, yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from this one. This is actually the reason why I'm a Hoppian. If I had to state one difference between Hoppians and just kind of normal libertarians, or even libertarians who reject Hoppa, and I know this is going to sound a little bit preachy, but I have to say it because it's true, is I think the main difference is that those of us who are Hoppians understand human psychology in addition to libertarian philosophy. Yes, people will ultimately want to live around those who are similar to themselves in culture. It's just a fact. If you study human psychology at length for any amount of time, you'll realize this is a fact. If you just study human history and civilizations and how they tend to form, it's a pretty obvious fact. And so yes, in a truly free market society, in Ancapistan as you could say it, what it would ultimately end up looking like is a whole bunch of gated private communities. And yes, many of them would have certain cultural requirements to join them. And what that essentially means is that identity politics isn't necessarily always bad. It's only bad when it doesn't make market sense. It's bad, basically, when it violates other people's rights. Which, of course, is the problem with identity politics today as we're living in democracy. Because the incentive when it comes to idpol under democracy is to basically vote in favor of your identity group at the expense of other identity groups. It essentially guarantees conflict. Like if you just look at the whole leftist voting for equity grift, the logical conclusion of it is just anti-white racism. And the reality is that happens because democracy makes it so there can be no other conclusion. Anyway, next question. Now getting into public subscribers. What are your thoughts on all the shikes going on with Candace Owens and her investigative journalism regarding the Kirk assassination and her claims that the French government has paid for her assassination? I want to default to dismissing her as an op, but she's very convincing. Okay, I'll just admit first of all that I don't really watch or listen to Candace Owens very often, and I'm going to say something that's going to sound mean. I don't mean to rag on her too much, but my problem with Candace Owens is that she's one of those people who will just kind of ramble on about nothing for 30 minutes straight before actually having a point. So I may not be the best person to ask about Candace because I can't really watch her. However, I will say this. If the French government did pay for her assassination, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not saying that I definitely know that that's the case because I have absolutely no idea. But I wouldn't be surprised by it because governments just in general tend to have a lot of psychopaths in their ranks who will often aim for positions of power that have low accountability, and as a result, governments have done things like that in the past. But in this particular case, I don't really know. Next question. So what you're saying is the problem with the economy isn't capitalism, it's actually a lack of more capitalism. Well, sort of. That's not really a good way to put it. It's more like the problem with the economy is that we don't have enough voluntary exchange. When the government accepts a bribe to pass a law in favor of the person bribing them, however the bribe is done, whether directly or indirectly or through a bunch of different transactions, or even just simply incentive structures to get around anti-bribery laws, what's basically going on when that happens is that it's an effect of the non-productive class. Or as I like to put it, it's the ability to hire a hitman and have that hiring process be considered legal. That effectively is what the state actually is, at least in the way that we right-wing libertarians define the state. That's why a very simple way to understand Ancapistan sometimes is just understand it as the logical conclusion of society built around the nap. And so when a corporation bribes the state to do something for them, or crony capitalism as it's sometimes called, I don't like that term because it's not really capitalism. What's really going on is that the corporation doing that is just trying to gain the benefits of the non-productive class. So it's more accurate to say that the problem with the economy isn't capitalism, it's actually the existence of parasites. It's the people who make their living in some way or form or another from the act of stealing from others. Next question. I wonder if I ever met some nutcase like Destiny, would I succumb to my 1% desire for instant gratification? I mean, it depends on what that instant gratification is. I do not recommend in any way, or do I condone violence in any way. So if that's what you're thinking, you should not do that. But it might be funny to just ask him something like, is Islam right about women, and see him spur out. That might be entertaining. That's something silly that I might do. Probably not. I'd probably just ignore him, to be honest. Next Next question. I wonder, in your video about ranking political ideologies, why did you put the Dark Enlightenment way above authoritarian capitalists, even though that authoritarian capitalism and the NRX movement are fairly similar to each other? Please reply to my comment. Well, good for you. I'm replying to your comment in the video. The reason why is that the general concept of authoritarian capitalism is kind of a meme ideology that can arise from a bunch of different directions. I rate NRX higher even though they basically believe that the state should have some impact on capitalism, because first of all, the NRX movement, then some of them are either libertarian or post-libertarian in some way, and so some of the NRX movement is actually okay. But the general gist of it is that NRX tends to not necessarily be for full-on authoritarian capitalism, even though that term kind of doesn't make much sense. The NRX movement usually tends to have a much better idea of what's wrong with society. They tend to have a full understanding of the non-productive class and the problems that arises from it. They just don't have the best solution. But a big reason I rate NRX higher than just general authoritarian capitalism is because it's technically possible to be NRX while still also being a libertarian. For instance, Hoppians like myself, to some degree, are on the line between libertarian ideology and NRX ideology. Hopefully that makes sense. I am a bit forced to oversimplify quite a bit for some of these answers because it is just a QA video and I gotta get to other questions. So speaking of which, next question. I do not understand how capitalism prevents corruption, or was it reducing government leads to less corruption because the government is the issue? Yes, pretty much. But again, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, it's the issue of the non-productive class. What a non-productive class is that they are a class that doesn't actually have to voluntarily get their wealth from other people in order to fulfill their economic wants. Or a more accurate way to put it is that it's a class that is allowed to violate the NAP and face effectively zero legal consequences. And corruption, well, if you're talking about cronyism, well, that's just a corporation recognizing the state for what it actually is. A system that allows them to legally screw over other people. That's what's really going on in terms of the quote-unquote corruption. And that's why reducing, preferably getting rid of the non-productive class, is the answer to the issue. Now, that doesn't mean that bad stuff will never happen in Ancapistan, or bad stuff will never happen in any other kind of libertarian imagined society, because people can definitely be jerks. I think actually that's one of the weaknesses of libertarian ideology, is that it's actually not a utopian ideology. We very much recognize and understand that there will still be people partaking in some relatively questionable business dealings. It's just that things are better off overall when you don't have a recognized non-productive class. In fact, if you really want to simplify things, you could even say that libertarian philosophy is somewhat rooted in the realization that the main fundamental problem with government is that it just lacks accountability. And because of that lack of accountability, that's where the incentives come in that actually cause the corruption to begin with. Next question. As to the housing issue, why not make it illegal for corporations to own housing? And I mean specifically buildings meant for people to live in. Only a private individual can own a home, house, apartment, etc. Companies are allowed to build homes, but only with the allowance to sell those homes, and then only to private individuals, and the homeowner can face increased taxation if they own more like 3 homes to their name. That is a good question, and that's one thing where the consequentialists kind of get tied up in, because in the immediate heat of the moment, I can definitely see how that might make sense. The problem comes down to the fact that to actually put that into action is very, very complicated and has a lot of second-order effects. For example, what if they build a house but then later want to turn it into a business building? You run into little weird nuances like that. And then there's just the general problem where in order to make that work, you have to essentially give the government control over all property and just hope that they do the right thing with it. Hope that they do what you want them to do with it. And the reality is they end up not doing that. That's kind of the issue with a lot of statist solutions, that it sounds good when you say it, but then when you put it into practice, well, because it's the non-productive class doing it, they can only really do it by threatening coercion. And so there's always going to be some kind of negative consequence with that. They're always taking money away from some part of the economy and putting it in a less productive slot in order to accomplish what you're asking them to do. The real problem really just comes back to the issue of corruption in the other question. The problem is a lot of these corporations that buy up housing are also flipping back and lobbying the government and bribing politicians and whatnot to increase zoning restrictions, thus creating an unnatural monopoly, thus increasing the value of their properties. Or in some cases, those companies, when they're big enough, they almost effectively get to write the zoning laws themselves. I mean, not directly, of course, but they practically do. And so that's the real problem with housing, is that the government doesn't really let us build more housing. And the reasons why they don't really let you build more housing, well, it's not exactly ethical reasons, we'll just say. Next question. Not a gotcha question, but why does solar energy through subsidies have gotten cheaper or on par with coal now? Does this not prove that although subsidy cannot be an end goal, it's a relatively better way to reach a milestone post, which we can let free market do whatever it wants? This is another good question, and it kind of goes down to the general problem of subsidies. Yes, consequentially, subsidies can reduce the price of pretty much any kind of service or good. For example, if we decided to taxpayer subsidize waitresses for some reason, make it so that every female waitress, in order to help women through college or whatever, now gets a $10 per hour bonus on the dime of the taxpayer. In the short run, yep, that does increase their wages, and that does help out the women who benefit from that kind of rule in the short run, but the problem is it, of course, is doing it through taxation. So it's taking away somewhere else in the economy, stealing from somebody else in order to redirect it towards the goal of the state. And that necessarily comes with the cost of actually enacting that policy, which means it will always be less efficient than what the market does. So yes, if you subsidize the production of solar energy, then it's going to get less expensive faster. But you have to ask yourself the question, at the cost of what? Who are you screwing over in order to get that subsidy? This is actually the main reason why empiricist ways of looking at the economy and how the government injecting their money into certain sectors of the economy is just an inherently flawed way of looking at economics. If you just look at it on paper and say, okay, government subsidy happened, and then supposedly good thing happened, well, that's ignoring the overall impact on the economy. It's ignoring any possible second or third order effects. Next question. Hey, Mentiswave, what are your thoughts, criticisms about a low across-the-board flat tax rate? 10% for everyone, stupid idea, or at least a little better than what we've got? Well, you kind of answered your own question there. It's a little better than what we've got. The main issue with the progressive taxation system is that the way taxes work, people have realized that it doesn't really make sense to tax people based on their profits and losses. And as a result of that, the tax code is insanely complicated. And so the actual taxes that people end up paying usually don't match what the progressives' idea of it is within progressive tax systems. And of course, going back to corruption in the non-productive class, of course, a lot of the crappy tax code has been written by them directly. And if you ask any honest person who works in tax preparation, they'll basically admit to you that it's a rigged system. A lot of our tax code is specifically designed to basically screw over the middle class. And so a flat tax would be better. However, if and only if that flat tax is a significantly lower tax rate than we currently have. I would only support it if as long as it's at least incrementally making things better. And of course, coming in package with a reduction in government spending. And it's also not exactly the best idea we've had. If I had no button to make the Hoppy and Ancapistan Society Happen Now button, if I had to choose some kind of tax code but reducing taxes by 10% in general all over, I would probably keep a little bit of the progressive tax system we currently have, and then change the welfare system into a negative income tax for the poor. That's not good, but again, it's at least better than what we currently have, and it would be better than a totally flat tax rate. Next question. The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Okay, so what is to be done about it? Yeah, that's a hard one. That's another bit of a tiny black pill, because there really isn't much we can do about it in the immediate short run anyway. All you can really do about the fact that democracy isn't very good and that you're one of the people, or we're one of the few people who realize that democracy is not the best system, all we can do for now is just keep speaking truth to power. A lot of change ultimately requires the masses to recognize what is true and what is not, and until that happens, sometimes things can seem a little bit bleak. And there's a lot of nonsense out there to deal with. I mean, just completely aside from libertarianism, for example, even just outside of political partisan issues, there is a whole crap ton of nonsense out there to refute. I mean, I'm kind of trying to do my part by having a channel that's mostly dedicated to refuting nonsense, some of it being libertarianism, some of it being general cultural issues, and some of it being just general philosophy. And I'm doing that because basically it's the best thing I can think of to do for now. But yeah, we're not exactly in the best state yet. We still have a lot of major issues, like for example, it's still not exactly within the Overton window to talk about how Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't exactly a good thing. And so just little things like that show us that we have a lot of work to do. Try not to get too depressed about it. Anyway, next question. You mentioned violence in self-defense, but if you know the other party intends violence, that they want to hurt or kill you, do you believe preemptive violence is morally justified? That is another good one. That one really depends on the simple answer to the question, how do you know for sure that they really intend violence on you? Because there is such a thing as fighting words. For instance, if someone literally says, I am going to kill you, and they reach for their pocket, I mean, at that point, what, are you going to wait until after they've shot you? You don't have magic knowledge of what they're going to do. You have no reason to suspect that they're lying in the moment. You have no way of knowing. And because of that, it's another one of those things where, annoyingly, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. It's important not to justify it outright, though, because that's where you get people justifying really weird stuff, like falsely accusing people of plotting to hurt them, and then using that as a justification to hurt them, while falsely claiming victimhood. So it depends on the evidence of the situation. Like, for example, one conversation I heard once is the question of, would engaging in Project Sundial violate the NAP? And if you don't know what that is, it was a United States government project to build a nuke so massive that it would effectively destroy the world. The idea being that you'd have this nuke that you could then just use as collateral of saying, okay, if you don't do what we want, we're just going to blow up everybody. Would the building of such a weapon effectively violate the NAP? Would be creating a possible doomsday? Would the act of making it violate the NAP? That's where things get really gray, but to some degree I think it kind of does violate the NAP. Because it's not really the same thing as having a weapon. The only reason you would create such a device is if you intend to threaten others with it. It can't really be considered self-defense at that point. Yeah, complex topic, I know. Hopefully that simplification made sense. Next question. Why do they always say, "Dear leader, the right isn't the one who can't criticize their own side"? And I don't mean softball disagreement, I mean serious issues. The left are the ones propping up turds as if they're saviors, and they're utterly uninformed about their own side, but especially the opposite. They just imagine wild caricatures and act like that's reality. Well, the answer to this one is that it's half projection and half kind of correct. There is, in fact, a lot of people out there who just accept anything Donald Trump does or says as gospel truth. So there's a lot of MAGA cultists out there, as you could say. However, I would say it is a little bit worse on the left. You're much more likely to find someone on the right who admits that Trump isn't exactly the greatest man ever than you are to find someone on the left who accepts that Obama and Biden aren't any better. And so in regards to Destiny kind of sneering at Trump supporters by saying that, oh, they all view Trump as the dear leader and we can't question him, that is projection. Destiny basically defended the same crap when Biden was doing it. Trump is ultimately, just as I've said before and proven before, just kind of a milquetoast 90s, 80s centrist. A lot of the criticisms being thrown at Trump are criticisms that can just as easily be used against the Democratic Party of 20 years ago or so, or even 5 years ago. And so it's really just stupid partisan politics, really. Good when my team does it, bad when other team does it, no principles behind it whatsoever. No attempt at having a consistent philosophy. Yeah, it's dumb. Next question. Is Mentiswave okay? He sounds congested. Yeah, I've been dealing with the chronic illness for about 1.5 years now. It has not been fun, and so some of my videos might sound a bit muffled. I do apologize for that. Next question. In response again to the video I did on Destiny, I know people need content, but if you really are against his views, aka Destiny, then not mentioning him or only focusing on his scandals, of which there are many, would be much better. So the thing is, the reason I occasionally use Destiny as a source to be refuted isn't so much because I care about Destiny. I actually give very little craps about E-drama and stuff. I mean, I'm aware of it, I'm aware he's done some dumb, shady things, but I quite frankly don't really care about that. The reason I occasionally make videos refuting Destiny isn't so much anything to do with Destiny, but because he kind of represents the epitome of the far lefty debate bro type. He's basically found himself in the same camp as Voosh, where he spreads nonsense by focusing on this snappy, on-the-spot reasoning, and this idea that if you can out-rhetoric someone in a debate, then that makes you correct. And it's a very, very cancerous way of thinking. And that's the reason I occasionally go and try and prove it wrong. Because people need to understand that the kind of debate bro reaction-op content that they make is not good content for discerning truth. On the spot, as in epistemology, is terrible reasoning. There's a very, very, very good reason why academics don't see debate your findings with a member of the Flat Earth Society as an important part of discerning truth. And people really need to understand better why that is dumb. Next question. So if Trump cured cancer, they would still be mad? Yes, they would still be mad. Or they would just downplay it heavily. That's kind of the issue with TDS and what I meant by calling out TDS. They hate Trump so much that they will find a reason to hate everything he does, rather than honestly seeing what he's doing and honestly telling, okay, this is something Trump did that was good, and this is something that Trump did that was bad. Because as I've said before in the past, Trump is surprisingly moderate. When you actually examine what policies Trump passes, he does in fact reveal himself to be basically a 90s moderate, as I've said before. And this puts the Democrats in a really precarious position, because they can't actually disagree with much of what Trump does on any kind of principle. Because there is in fact plenty of bad stuff that Trump has done. Tariffs, floating a regime change war, infinity plus $1 billion tax dollars for Israel, barely reducing tax dollars at all, and of course not really doing much much to meaningfully drain the swamp. And so much of what he's doing is quite surprisingly status quo. And yet the Democrats have been told by the media ad nauseum to just hate Trump because Orange Man bad, everything Trump do bad, and yet Trump is only doing things slightly different, maybe slightly better, I'd say, than what the Democrats would have done. And so the Trump derangement syndrome sufferers, what they must do is they must find stupid reasons to criticize Trump. Whining about him renovating the White House or building a ballroom or something, just completely inconsequential nonsense. And they also can't admit it when Trump does something right. Which, hilariously enough, that is one of the things that Trump is doing right. He's building that ballroom using, from what I've understood, private funds, rather than paying for it on the taxpayer's dime. That's actually kind of a good thing. And yet that's what they chose to whine about. And of course, they can definitely not give Trump credit for the good things he does. For instance, Doge was fairly decent. The only problem with Doge is that it just didn't go hard enough. And he did at least extend the 2017 tax cuts. And the TDSers are just completely blind to that. Next question. But how long are you going to make a video about refuting Dev? Short fat utaku. Okay. I honestly get this question a lot. Every time I do a QA, this comes up. The thing with Dev is that a lot of his bad takes aren't bad enough to really warrant refutation. He's a very standard liberal centrist, and like all liberal centrists, he has some good takes and has some bad takes. I have considered answering his video towards why he's not a libertarian, because that actually did include a lot of your general centrist concerns against libertarianism, and how they tend to reject it based on not really understanding the philosophy at all. That is definitely in the backlog of videos for me to make. As for when I'll get to it, I'm not sure, because I still got a few things that are kind of up at the top of the list. For instance, I think explaining the problem with Fuentes is a little bit more important right now, and so that's the video I'm a bit more focused on getting finished before the end of this month. Next question. Bush claims to be a libertarian socialist, quote unquote, but also claims that the state is the only mechanism that can feed the poor. How are people supposed to get rid of the state if they're entirely dependent on it? Well, the answer to that is you just kind of have to always remind yourself of the standard contradiction that libertarian socialism finds itself in. The whole libertarian socialist or anarcho-communist way of thinking, their entire ideology defines anarchy as being against hierarchies. And of course, that is a fundamental contradiction of reality because you can't actually be against hierarchies. Hierarchies will form voluntarily through natural human interaction, which means the only way you can possibly be against hierarchies is if you create a bigger hierarchy to stop people from voluntarily creating smaller hierarchies. And so ultimately, when their beliefs are pushed to their logical conclusions, they end up not actually believing what they claim to believe. And thus, every single libertarian socialist is either philosophically illiterate in that they don't understand their own ideology, or they're just lying, or they're just a tanky pretending to be a libertarian. But perhaps the best way to understand it is just the age-old mantra of ignoring what people say and watching what they do. Every single quote-unquote libertarian socialist, without fail, ends up voting for more authoritarian policies. Just about. Nearly 100%. Maybe there's a few exceptions, but most of the time not really. They're always voting for more state regulations, more gives-me-dats, and higher taxes. And so that's another way you can tell that they're just statists. Next question. What's activated my almonds is the sign language interpreter for Biden. What utility is the sign language interpreter on a medium that has closed captioning readily available? Further, what utility do the ridiculous facial expressions have for a hand-based language? Well, for the second part of that question, actually, people who are deaf rely quite heavily on facial expressions because they can't hear tone for emotion. However, why they need a sign language interpreter when they already have closed captions, and of course, Biden speaking has his own facial expressions that they can read? The answer to that is, to some degree, it's just virtue signaling at that point. Yeah, it is a little bit unnecessary. That part does help deaf people out a little bit though, but on the flip side, it is just a little bit trying to appear more inclusive. That's all. It's kind of normal for left liberal politicians to do this kind of thing because hyper-inclusivity is a part of their ideology, and so that's why you often see them do strange things, tripping over themselves and going over the top in order to appear in that way. But yes, you are kind of correct on that note. It's a little bit pointless. Any deaf person that's into politics probably knows how to read. Next question. And what about when it comes to producing your own food? You know, this may seem like a silly question to answer, but it's kind of important to go over, because I think one thing a lot of people don't realize in a case where libertarians are absolutely correct is that our overly strict zoning laws do in fact very, very much spike up the cost of land, which makes it almost impossible to produce your own food to some degree. Unless you're very rich, you will not be able to afford a piece of land that has the multiple acres needed in order to create a self-sustaining self-sustaining homestead. And it's not because there isn't land to use. There's plenty of unused land out there still. You're just not going to ever be allowed to build on it. Next question. What if we live in a sci-fi Star Trek utopia where things don't cost money or labor to produce because it's all automated and the machines maintain themselves? Since you wouldn't be reliant on the labor of others, would it then make such rights okay? Well, I mean, in a post-scarcity society like that, which is basically what you're describing, it wouldn't really matter if those rights are there because you don't really have scarcity anymore. In fact, negative rights are pretty much the only rights that would make sense in that society. Because despite being able to have machines do everything for you, two people still would not be able to occupy the same plot of land. So you'd still have room for conflict there. The only difference, though, is that if machines can produce everything, as long as you don't have IP laws preventing other people from also making those machines, then everybody would pretty much have near equal access to the benefits of such a society with no scarcity. If we're really thinking of a hypothetical world where you can just press a button and food effectively just magically appears, you don't actually need the right to food in that situation. You just need the right to be allowed to reproduce that machine. Hopefully that makes sense. Next question. What's the game in the background? Well, the game I'm playing for this video is Tower of Fantasy, but this of course is in response to a different video. Now, the reason I'm replying to this question is because pretty much every single Game Rant video I have, somebody asks this question. The answer is I always include it in the description box. If you click on that show more under the video and scroll down past my links, you'll see that I have the video game name listed there for pretty much all of those videos. Next question. The Charlotte Area Transportation System, CATS, is making all tram and bus fares free tomorrow, Election Day, to allow passengers to go to their polling places. What's interesting is that one of the items to be voted on is a 1% sales tax to fund transportation projects around Charlotte, which includes plenty of money for the CATS to expand. This is just me, but it sounds like it can be argued that this is a city government department standing to benefit from this voting item, and from that it can be argued the department, and by proxy the city government itself, is making decisions to influence an election towards its own benefit. Something about this just smells off like a conflict of interest. Love to hear your input. Yep, that's definitely a conflict of interest. And I'll also go further and double down on that and just say that democracy in general, it's not really possible to avoid conflicts of interest in democracy. Because you have to remember, the basis of democracy, when you view democracy as a moral philosophy, it effectively states that it's okay for A and B to agree with each other to rip off C. It is thus the idea that your right to your property depends entirely on whether or not other people agree that you have that right. And therefore, there will always be a very perverse incentive for politicians to do everything they can to increase the number of voter cattle in their favor. And unfortunately, we're kind of already at the point where politicians have figured out that they can keep themselves in power by simply bribing the public with their own money. And so what you just described there with them making all the tram and bus fares free on a day that they're voting on something that would further subsidize tram and bus fares, well, that's just another example of that we've already been seeing for quite a while now. It's just another example of politicians leading their voter cattle with a carrot on a stick. And that is a feature of democracy, not a bug. Next question. I'd love to have access to some of the memes you use in these videos. Would you voluntarily share the memes you use in these videos? So yes, sort of. I have too many memes to share, to be honest, but I do post a lot of the more original content memes that I've personally made on X. So if you follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, I know it's kind of silly, we're still calling it Twitter even though it's been X for a while now. If you follow me there and go to the media tab, I often re-upload some of the memes that I've personally created there. Next question. Why don't light bulbs, batteries, penicillin, the combustion engine, the Fritz Haber process, refrigeration, or the internet qualify for cultural appropriation? I'm not terribly bright. I need someone to help me with this question. Okay, seriously though, the reason why a lot of things that you would think would qualify for cultural appropriation is because the people who complain about cultural appropriation don't actually believe what they're saying. Because you have to remember that it's a component of woke ideology, and the only thing that woke ideology really believes in at the end of the day is being envious and spiteful towards the groups that they consider to be more successful. That's all they really believe in, at least with any level of consistency. All of the equity and DEI and victimhood rhetoric that they give, all of that is just pseudo-intellectual justifications for said spite. And cultural appropriation is really just another one of those pseudo-intellectual justifications. They don't actually care that culture is being appropriated. They're just getting upset over the fact that they see it being done by someone who, at least on the surface, appears to be straight and white. But of course, they can't actually say that out loud, because if the leaders of woke ideology just admitted that wokeness is mostly just anti-white racism, then, well, the grift would kind of be up too quickly. And so therefore they need to obfuscate what they actually believe, and the fact that you're seeing inconsistency in how they apply cultural appropriation is just a natural part of that obfuscation. Next question. Could you please make a 10-hour long ASMR video of refuting communist points? I could probably listen to that for hours. I mean, in some way I kind kind of already have. I've made so many videos doing just that if you go through one of my playlists, you'll probably kind of find something similar to that. Both my high octane content and my gamer rant playlists are pretty long, and yeah, not all of the videos are about refuting communist talking points, but honestly, even the ones that aren't directed at actual just libertarian theory or economics, even those have a little bit to do with neo-Marxist ideology. Most of what I refute, even if it's just some culture war stuff, does in fact still have relevance towards lib-right theory. Like for example, the videos I've done on Gamergate. Well, on the surface of that may just seem like gaming and culture wars within game dev. When you really understand what happened during Gamergate, you'll realize that there was a lot of background radiation in a lot of media corruption, and when you look into the reasons behind why that media corruption exists, you will ultimately uncover some conflict of interest that a lot of big media publishers have with the state. So you could probably just turn on my gamer rant playlist, because there's a lot of videos in that one, and that'll come close to what you want. Maybe. Probably not really ASMR though, but whatever. Let's just move on to the next question. What do you think about voluntarism? I mean, voluntarism is really just another way of saying anarcho-capitalism without really calling it anarcho-capitalism, to my understanding. The question of whether or not anarcho-capitalists should rebrand and drop the label anarchy is one thing that I'm actually kind of on the fence on, because there's really good arguments either way. Because on the plus side, rebranding would make things more understandable to the normies, because normies, when they hear the word anarchy, they think of something completely different. They usually think of what the leftist definition of anarchy is, being against hierarchies or something like that, or they think of chaos or something like that. And of course, neither of those are an accurate representation of libertarian theory, and so naturally people, when they hear the word anarchy, your average normie is just going to completely misunderstand it. But on the downside, dropping the term anarchy almost comes across as weak. It almost feels like admitting that we're wrong about something when we really weren't wrong, because when you analyze it further, it makes more sense that right-wing libertarianism is in fact the least amount of government you can possibly have, while having society still work and be a society. And so there's a lot of extra nuances like that. Next question. Could you please do a future video about unreliable Grok actually is? I think you meant to put how unreliable Grok actually is there, but yeah, we'll go with that. Yeah, that is kind of a good video idea. I have thought about that, and not just so much Grok, but just AI in general. AI right now is really good for, I'd say, memes, and it's also fairly good as an alternative search engine, so long as you make sure you tell the AI to link the source of what they're saying. Because yes, AI is still very much just a very complex LLM, which means that it's often just gonna make stuff up. And worst part about it is that when AI makes something up, just kind of invents a source or invents a study that just never actually happened, it does so very confidently. It'll tell you the numbers and the date of the study. It'll lie to you in ways that a normal person would never lie to you, which sadly enough also makes it so that a lot of people don't catch the lies. Which is sad, because we're kind of starting to see the sort of a rise of the AI midwit. People who trust AI for everything in the same way that midwits of the past trusted Wikipedia for everything. Except this is honestly actually in many ways worse. AI is actually less honest. And I definitely have seen it firsthand quite a lot, because again, I use AI as a search engine sometimes. Because Grok especially is a really good search engine. In many ways, it's better than Google. Simply because you can ask it a lot more complicated questions. You can ask to find a specific study that looks at a specific thing, and oftentimes it will find it for you. And of course, that brings with it a problem that some people are going to use it to find academic research and just trust Grok on its face, without actually checking the research to see if A, it actually exists, and B, it actually says what Grok claims it says. Because oftentimes it doesn't. So yeah, it's kind of sad that a lot of people just sort of let AI think for them, and they don't actually read the research papers that they find with AI, or again, make sure that AI didn't just flat out make it up. Next question. Jesus, I haven't been paying attention. I had no idea that you've been sick. Saw the GoFundMe. Are there any updates on that? Any prevailing theories? You know what? I think I'll make this the last question, because I figure people who actually care about the answer to this one will have made it to the end of this video. Yes, I've been battling an annoying chronic illness for about a year and a half. Yes, it sucks. It's not cancer. It's probably not something that's going to be fatal. In fact, my doctors currently have it most likely as some kind of form of cervical instability, which if you're familiar with what that is, it's very, very hard to get a diagnosis for. It's one of those chronic illnesses that doctors just kind of get baffled over and they can't figure it out, and so they're constantly giving you referrals somewhere else. And yeah, it's just in general been a pain in the butt, because on some days, mainly bad days, I can't really do much. And it's been pretty annoying because I've been wanting to start a podcast soon. In fact, I was in the beginning stages of creating a podcast when I came down with this illness, and I've just kind of had to put that on pause until I get better, which hopefully will be soon, because at the very least I've found some treatments that help me now. So I am actually doing better than than what I was, say, 3 months ago. But yeah, it's been annoying, and it sucks. I wish I could make more content. I have a massive backlog of videos that I've said I've been looking into making, and who knows, maybe I'll be able to get to most of them. I'll try to end this with a little bit of optimism. But anyways, that is all. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by becoming a member of the channel, or by buying some merch. That is all. Till next time.